There are two ways to discover a podcast on a podcast directory like that of Apple Podcasts. The first one is to use the search and search with a particular term. And the second one is to browse through the different categories that are available and pick the right podcast to listen to. Imagine if you have a podcast on motivation tips and your podcast is buried deep in the how-to category on Apple Podcasts. You've already lost quite a bit of listeners who might be searching for a podcast on motivational tips. In this episode, I'll share 3 simple tips on how to find the right category for your podcast on the different podcast directories, and also share the importance of picking the right category for your podcast. So let's get started. Hello and welcome to TPU TV. This is Dilip. If you don't know me, I'm a blogger, podcaster and affiliate marketer, and I share a lot of simple, practical and implementable podcasting tips on this channel. You'll be able to find a lot of tutorial videos. You'll be able to find a lot of information that you would otherwise not find on a lot of the podcasting related channels on YouTube on this channel. So if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, then you might want to do it right now. And if you're new to podcasting and want to get started with your own podcast, then you can join my free 10-day course on how to start a podcast. You'll be able to join the course at thepodcastinguniversity.com/free-guide. You'll be able to find a link in the description box below. Go ahead, click the link and join the free course today. Now, on to today's episode. Now, one of the things that I'm often confused with is categories, be it YouTube, blog post, or even for that matter, shopping on Amazon. I am confused with the categories that are available on all of these platforms. In fact, a lot of times I feel that they don't have enough categories to fit all of the products, and they just fit some products into some categories that might just be irrelevant for that particular product. And sometimes I feel that they have so many categories that it becomes difficult for you to search for the right products on a particular category. It is the same in podcasting as well. A couple of months, my podcast ranked on the top 10 podcasts in Apple Podcasts how-to category. And while I was browsing through that category, there were almost about 115 odd podcasts that were showing up in that category. While I was browsing through that category, I came across a lot of podcasts that didn't really fit into the how-to category, and they were buried deep down there in that category. Maybe the 100, 120, 150th position. It is very unlikely that people will find that podcast in that particular category. And then I also found that there were some podcasts that were featuring in a completely different category but should ideally have been in the how-to category. There again, they were buried deep in the category, and hence they were losing a lot of prospective listeners. I'm sure you too would have faced this confusing situation when you were submitting your podcast to the different podcasting directories. And a lot of us wouldn't even have cared on what category we picked while we were submitting our podcast to these directories. But then, did you know that picking the right category for your podcast has a direct impact on your listenership? That's right. And that is what we are going to discuss in today's episode, and I'll be sharing 3 simple tips on how to pick the right category for your podcast. So let's get started. Being properly categorized on directory is important for 3 primary reasons. One is for getting found on directories. Now, while a lot of people might be using the search option on directories to find podcasts, there are quite a few who like browsing through the different categories and finding podcasts that they want to listen to. These are people who might not have a real choice, or they might not already be decided on what kind of a podcast they are planning to listen to. Now, if your podcast isn't listed in the right category, isn't available on the right shelves, then you lose all of these listeners. That's precious listenership for you. Why would you want to lose it? Number 2 is the podcast directory rankings. Now, this is another important thing to keep in mind. Most of these directories have a rankings for various categories, and that impacts the search visibility of your podcast on that particular directory. Now, mismatch means that your podcast is buried and will never get ranked. Like, for example, Apple Podcasts ranks podcasts on each individual category. If your podcast can get featured in the top 10 or maybe 20 in a particular category, the possibility of you getting a lot of new listeners is pretty high. But then, in order for your podcast to be ranked on a particular category, it should do well in that particular category. And it'll only do well in that particular category if people are able to find your podcast and people are listening to your podcast and enjoying them. But if your podcast is buried deep down somewhere, the possibility of people finding your podcast and listening to it is very remote. So that means that your show is not going to do well in that particular podcast category, and your show will never get ranked. So it's a cycle that impacts everything. So that makes it all the more important to ensure that your podcast is listed in the right category. Number 3, metadata and algorithms. Now, your podcast metadata helps algorithms recommend your show to people who are searching your show with specific keyword terms or with specific interests. And most podcast directories embed the particular category, the category terms or the tags that you're using into the podcast metadata so that their users are able to discover new podcasts. So picking the right podcast category ensures that your podcast has the right metadata, and consequently the directory is able to list your podcast or show your podcast in front of people who are looking for podcasts with a particular term, and that could get you a lot of new listeners for your podcast. So those were the top 3 reasons why you might want to ensure that your podcast is listed in the right category on all podcast directories. Now with that out of the way, let's look at the 3 simple tips, of finding the right podcast category for your podcast. Number 1 is an obvious one. Put yourself in your listeners' shoes and think of what will be the right category for your podcast. Now, you might want to ask some questions to yourself. Like, for example, if you searched for a show like that of yours, what terms would you use to search your podcast? What does your podcast offer? And what is the primary topic of your show? What niche does your podcast fit into? Now, you might want to answer these simple questions, and depending upon the answers for these questions, you might want to pick a category that fits your podcast. Don't look at each of these answers in silo. Look at it as a whole and decide on what category might best fit your podcast. Then pick that category for your podcast when submitting to a podcast directory. Number 2 is to study the top charts. Now, you can study the top charts in relevant genres on a particular podcast directory to see where podcasts that are similar to yours or maybe in the same niche are ranked or categorized. That should give you a fair idea of where your podcast should be placed. Something that you might want to keep in mind is that you will come across a lot of podcasts that might not be placed in the right category. They might be placed in some random category, and there they might be doing well. You can also give it a try, but I wouldn't recommend that because that's a mismatch. The possibility of your podcast also doing well in that mismatched category is very remote. So instead, what I would recommend is look for podcasts that are listed in the right categories. The right category meaning a category that talks to the niche for that particular podcast. Then see what is the best category for your podcast and accordingly submit your podcast to the podcast directories. Number 3 is to test different categories. Now, in the event that you see there are multiple categories where your podcast could fit into, or your podcast can be submitted to, you can go ahead and submit it to maybe one category and see if you're able to get listeners there. And based on the data that you get, you might be able to decide if you want to continue with that category or maybe move your podcast to a different category. But moving or changing the podcast category is a little technical. You will want to use the same platform that you use to submit your podcast to these directories to make that change, which can be a little technical for a lot of people. And that's why you might want to avoid it. But what I would recommend is to spend a little more time in evaluating your niche, comparing it with the available podcast categories, and then picking the right podcast category and submitting your podcasts there. Now, Apple Podcasts has about 18 top level categories with a lot of subcategories within that. And Spotify also has a deep content taxonomy. So you might want to take the time to explore the best category structures to find the best one that fits your podcast based on the topic, the format, the listener appeal, the niche, and all of these, and then invest that time to properly categorize your podcast. Now, this time investment will directly translate into higher listenership, improved rankings, and better monetization opportunities. So treat your podcast metadata with care and respect, and it'll reward you in return. So those are a few tips on how to find the best podcast category for your podcast when you're submitting to a podcast directory. I hope you like this video. If you like the information that I shared today, then do give this video a thumbs up because that will help others find this video and benefit from the information that I shared. And if you're new to this channel, then don't forget to hit the subscribe button and the bell notification so that you stay updated with all of the latest videos that I release. I release a new video every Friday on simple, practical, and implementable podcasting tips. And you don't want to miss any of the videos that I release. And if you have a question, then drop them in the comment box below. I would answer all of the comments there, and if your comment requires creating a video, I'll go ahead and create a video for you. That is all that I have for this video. I hope you enjoyed this video. I'll be back again the next week with another interesting information around podcasting. Until then, keep watching TPU TV and you have a wonderful rest of the week.